And greetings to everybody. It's so good to see you all. We had a wonderful drive down here today through the pouring deluge of rain. Cheryl pried my fingers off the steering wheel when we got here, and I'm all flexible again. I want to say greetings to everybody who's out there tuning in on the webcast. Hope everyone's in good health and feeling good. And I want to thank, Mike, for that wonderful sermon. It was very informative. It straightened me out. I had always thought the Zoroasters were the descendants of, or the ancestors of Zorro, the swashbuckling vigilante, helping the oppressed and poor of the land, but not quite so. By the way, I thought I had it made, but Christmas Eve, I didn't have any Magi's come, but I had 3 Margies come to the door, Margie O'Brien and Margie O'Shea and Margie O'Gillicuddy. They all had gifts, and I thought I was going to strike it rich with gold and all that kind of stuff, even though I don't keep Christmas. But, one should not be rude to people giving you gold and money and things like that. But it turns out they were really for the O'Connollys down the road, and I had to turn them away. But they were the Margies, not the Magi anyway, so it didn't really matter. You're a tough crowd out there. Anyway, I love road trips. I love traveling. I love to get out on the road. I mean, when I got my first car, my very own first car, not my dad's, it was like it opened the doors up to me. In this country, in America, the automobile represents freedom and the open road. And I enjoyed it. I just enjoyed getting in my car and going anywhere. And it's always the way I traveled and made trips, whether it was a business trip or whether it was during the Feast of Tabernacles when I got to see many parts of the world. I would go to a specific place, rent a car, do what I had to do, and then, particularly at the Feast of Tabernacles, we would take, Cheryl and I, another 2 or 3 weeks as we had opportunity and just drive. And she'd say, where are we going? If it's, France, I said, we're going to go see France. We were in New Zealand once. I said, we're going to see New Zealand. And she said, well, where are we going? I said, that way. And that's the way I would travel. I'd get a map and I'd look at it closely, not closely, just quickly and see kind of how big it is and far and say, we'll go that way. And we would just take off and drive. My brother-in-law once were in France and he said, you lost, Bill. I said, we're not lost. We got another week to get back to Paris. How big is France? It's like New Jersey. Come on, you don't get lost. Cheryl would say that too. You're lost. I said, I'm not lost. I haven't hit the Mississippi yet. I haven't hit the Atlantic Ocean. I'm right where I'm supposed to be. But I just love to travel. And a lot of times when you looked at the maps, I remember one trip, we went to Arizona for the feast. And after the feast, I said, we're going to drive up to Alaska and come down the coast highway and fly back from Los Angeles. It'll be fun. Problem is, I get distracted a lot. So as I'm driving, I see, a ghost town. Let's go check it out. And we go there and spend half the day messing around there, and we go here. Well, on the map, Alaska didn't look that far from Arizona. It was only about 8 inches. But about a week and a half into the trip, where were we? I had to cut across to San Francisco. I wasn't anywhere close to it, and I realized I've got to reassess this, cut across, and come back down. We still had a great trip, but I never made it to Alaska. I would have had to drive straight through and keep going, and that's not the way I like to travel. I just like to stop and see things. And that's the way it is. In life, we learn, don't we? Things are not always as they seem. Alaska was much, much further than that map led me to believe. It's a matter of your viewpoint, I guess, and a matter of perspective. Everything's a matter of perspective. If your perspective is skewed, you can overlook the reality. How many of us have flown in planes and looked down and everything seems so tiny and insignificant? You can see the roads and the highways and these If you could even see them, the little tiny specks moving along them, and you'd see farmland go by and other things. And everything's small and insignificant, tiny. But when you're down on the ground, things seem a lot bigger, don't they? The giant obstacles that stand in our way are much bigger from a ground level viewpoint than they are from far, far away in the sky. And it's easy to be overwhelmed and defeated by those giants. Each and every one of us are on a journey, aren't we? That's what life is about. Every human being on the face of the earth is on a life's journey. For us who have been called to do a work and be given God's Spirit, we're on a spiritual journey also. A life's journey and a spiritual journey. Everybody is on some kind of journey. Some get to think that journey is too far. Some get to think it's never ending or too tedious. When is it going to be over? And they get worn down and they get discouraged. It's not worth it to them. And in some cases, people commit suicide because it just gets overwhelming, life's journey and the problems. But that's life. There are mountains to climb in life. There are difficulties. There are these giant obstacles in our way. And some think the mountain, again, before them is much too high. They don't even want to attempt it. They don't have the gear, they think. They don't have the training. They're not prepared for it. We've all seen mountains. I was up in the Swiss Alps. From far away, they still look huge, but when you get up there, they're really, 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 really big. But it's a matter of perspective. We see pictures of them in the distance, and they say, oh, no, those are big mountains, but they don't look that difficult until you stand at the foot of them and you try to climb them and reach the summit. And it's just too much to deal with. It becomes too hard. Even if we try it and we start moving along, we realize, hey, I can't make it. I remember once we were in an island off of Australia. We were traveling, and we wanted to go to the other side of it, small little island. It was very hot, and it was very steep. My brother-in-law and my sister already went over there because he wanted to swim in this little cove over there. Cheryl and I went later. About a half an hour later, we packed up our water because, I don't know, it was about 100 degrees and humid, and it was a trek. We're walking up there, and we're walking up, and it's going uphill, up this mountain to get to the summit to go down the other side. It's like a volcano. It was hot. I'll tell you, I was dying. As we're walking, I hear this noise, this splashing and glugging noise. Glug, glug. I can't figure out what it was. Finally turned around. There's my wife behind me. She's pouring water over her head, you know. I said, what are you doing? She says, well, I'm hot. I'm hot. I need some water. I said, that's our water. That's our lifeblood there. We got to get over the top of this mountain. Down the other side is 100 degrees. What are you pouring the water all over your head for? Well, I'm hot. So that put a kibosh, as they say, on that trip. We had to turn around. We barely made it back down to the hotel and went right into the pool and just plopped into the pool. We were so hot. We would have never made it. It didn't seem like a long journey from when we were at the hotel. Well, it's a little bit of a hill and down the other side. Joe and Evelyn made it. They're not as in good shape as us, so we can do it. But it was, for us, insurmountable, especially when somebody's pouring all the water that we have on their heads. That's how it is in life. What about success, joy, happiness, contentment, and peace? We all desire those things, don't we? I don't think there's anyone that would say they don't want any of that. But what are those things anyway? Joy, happiness, peace, contentment. How can we achieve them? How can we achieve them? Doing it all by ourselves, by our own efforts. Is that how we get it? You know, do it your way, like the song goes that Frank Sinatra sang. Life, though, as created by God, was meant to be wonderful. That's how it was from the very beginning, wasn't it? Life was meant to be wonderful. Everything he said when he made the creation, including man, the Garden of Eden, he said it was good. It was very good. And that's how it was meant. But we know the story. Sin took hold. Life, living, then became difficult, didn't it? When man was cast out of that paradise and had to go it alone. It's not now a peaceful, easy living, as that song says, is it? For most of the world, at least, it's not. You can look around the Middle East. You can look around China. You might say, well, China's doing pretty good. No, they're not, especially if you're a Uyghur and other people, or a Christian. The continent of Africa, there's problems. In Cuba, people are oppressed. North Korea, people starve. Even in this country, in other Western nations, we see riots and war and frustration and hate and anger. It's not a peaceful, easy life. And in the end, as we say about life, no one gets out alive, right? No one gets out alive. We all die in the end. And how dreadful and hopeless that may seem for so many people. But the thing is, it's not really. It's all a matter of perspective. It's a matter of perspective. It's not dreadful. It's not hopeless, even though we all die at the end. It's a matter of perspective. And I ask you today, what's your perspective? Is your cup half full or half empty? You know that old saying. Somebody always sees a cup of water that's halfway full or empty, and they go like, there's only half a cup there. And the other says, oh, it's half full. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of attitude. Are those giants that you've encountered and will encounter day to day too big for you to overcome? Are they too high, too steep, too big, too fierce, too powerful? Well, the answer is no, they're not. You may think they are, but they're not. Rather, what they are opportunities for growth. Those things before us are all opportunities for growth. And that's what I want to speak to you about today. Our perspective when we encounter giants in our lives. Our perspective when we encounter giants in our lives. And the point is that all giants hindering our life and our spiritual journey are opportunities for growth. It's just a matter of perspective. I'll say that again. All giants hindering our life's journey, our spiritual journey, are giants, are opportunities for growth. It's just a matter of perspective. There's a song that I learned in Sunday school years ago. Yes, I did go to Sunday school years ago when I was a little boy. Sung by Tennessee Ernie Ford's famous song, it's I Love to Tell the Story. I love to tell the story. Well, that's me. I love to tell stories. I go to explain something and people say, get to the point, Bill. But I'm getting to the point. It's part of the journey, you see. I love to tell stories. I love to hear stories. And I love to read stories. I'm thankful that as a child I was encouraged to read. Read all the time. The fact is, when I was a kid, you kids might not know this, but when I was a kid, there was 5 channels, and the remote control was my brother. You know, you kick him and say, go change the channel. My little brother. And I was the remote control for my father. But there was only a few channels, and it went off, I think, at 11 o'clock anyway, but I was in bed long before that. So we read, and we were encouraged. I read stories by Jack London and Dickens and Shelley and Melville and Kenneth Robeson and others like that. And it was wonderful because stories, ideas are wrapped up in stories. They convey so many things to us. Books, movies, TVs do the same thing, and they do more to shape society's thinking than anything else I can think of. We're moved to action by short commercials, aren't we? Buy this. Look at this. Some commercials I watch make me cry. You know, those Budweiser commercials around Christmas time. They're so touching. Or the Chevrolet commercials. But they stir us to action, or they wouldn't be there. They're 30 seconds, and we go out and we decide we want to buy something. Yes, everyone loves a good story. Jesus and God the Father love a good story, and they themselves use stories to teach us, to shape our thoughts and our thinking, using narratives and events and people. God could have just given us the facts, and in some instances he does, but for the most part, God gives us stories. Jesus, when he was on the earth, taught many of the people around him through stories and powerful parables. They know that stories are memorable. They appeal to our imaginations. They stick with us. I can give you facts and say, do this, do that, do this, and this, but when you tell a story, as the Bible does, they stick with us. And that's why a lot of those stories are there. There is nothing in the Bible that is arbitrary, that are just put there that doesn't mean anything. Every story means something, and there's lessons to learn, and it affects us in many ways when we think and ponder and meditate on them. They're there for a purpose. Now, there are many fascinating and exciting stories in the Bible. There's also sad ones and there's funny ones. As a kid, I learned many of them. For example, Adam and Eve. We all know the story about Adam and Eve in the garden and the apple and the snake. Noah and the flood. How many kids don't know that story? The great flood. Samson. That was one of my great stories, Samson, you know. Daniel in the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace. The walls of Jericho. Marching around, and blowing some trumpets. And the walls come tumbling down. We remember all those things because they're told to us in stories. Well, this morning I'd like to review one such story. It's one of my favorite. And again, they're all there for a reason. They're not just entertainment. Now, this is an old story, but the message is useful for us today. And is useful for this message today and the point that I'm trying to make. It's a story about a young man and his battle against a giant a long time ago. You already know who I'm talking about, don't you? There is much one can learn or glean from this story. And when I read it again, I realized I could probably make 4 or 5 different sermons about different aspects and points and lessons in this story. But at its core, I believe this is a story about opportunities and perspective. Opportunities disguised as impossible problems. You see, today I want to show you through this story of David and Goliath how those giants we find standing in our way are opportunities, not obstructions. It's all a matter of perspective. Think about it. When your perspective is from the ground up, we talked about, when you're looking from this level, as human beings, from the ground up, giants are overwhelming. They're too big. They're too large. They're too fearsome. They're overwhelming. The last thing you want to do is to confront one, especially a big, old, nasty, vile giant, whether it's in human form or any other form. We don't want to go toe-to-toe with those giants, do we? But for those who look at things from a God-level perspective, from heaven above, alongside God and looking down at these giants, giants should ignite our souls, cause the adrenaline to flow, because we have God behind us, and we're looking with him at these giants. And all we have to say is, how do you want to take this guy out? Give me one of the 10 ways. How do you want to deal with this? It's a different perspective. We should be excited about that because those giants, from that perspective, will always be defeated. They are opportunities. They are foes to crush. They're doors that we can walk through. So let's take a look at this story in the background. It's in 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15. Let's start in verse 24 and 28. And Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. We know what Saul did there. He was told to go and wipe out this nation and all of the men, women, children, animals, and everything, and take nothing. And he didn't do that. They saved the king, and they saved a lot of good livestock. So he sinned, and Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore I pray thee, pardon my sin, and turn again with me, that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said to Saul, I'll not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. So, verse 27, and as Samuel turned about to go away, Saul laid hold upon the skirt of his mantle, and it tore. And Samuel said unto him, the Lord has rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours that is better than you. Dropping down to verse 34. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house to Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. Chapter 16, verse 1, and the Lord said unto Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil, and go, I will send you to Jesse of the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Let's drop down to verse 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, here are here all your children? As you know, Jesse brought all of his sons from the oldest on down, and everyone was rejected. Samuel says to Jesse, are here all your children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he keeps the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he comes hither. And he sent, and he brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal a beautiful countenance. He's a good-looking fellow. Nice guy, fair, but good-looking fellow, and goodly to look into. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. It's a sad story in a way, that Saul lost his kingship, his kingdom, in the favor of God. God turned his back on him and left him and chose someone else, David, this young man. Let's top over to chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle. Seems like the Israelites and the Philistines were always going at it. They gathered their armies to battle and were gathered together at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and pitched between Succoth and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. I have this book called The Battles of the Bible. This gentleman goes from a military standpoint, all the battles in the Bible, and he discusses them, the strategies and the tactics and the land and where they were standing. It's very, very interesting. The Bible doesn't necessarily go into all of this, but if you look at maps and you understand the terrain and everything, you can read a lot more into it. But this tells a story now. Imagine this scene. Imagine one early morning near a beautiful sprawling valley covered with grass and flowers. A beautiful valley. But sadly, at this particular time, a place of imminent war. On this particular morning, as the sun began to rise, burning off the dew and the mist of the valley, men can be seen moving quietly out to the edge of the valley called Elah, hastily eating perhaps the last bit of bread and honey, and cheese, washed down with a cool drink of water or goat's milk, while adjusting their spears, slings, helmets, and other gear. You can hear that rattling in the quiet. They moved into place for battle. You can imagine in any battle, the mood was pensive, uneasy, anxious. Men on both sides with spears and armaments. An eerie silence fills the air as the light of the day breaks and a gentle breeze blows across the grass and flowers in their faces. It's a beautiful morning indeed, but it's about to change. In the middle of the attack line, an officer raises his arm, and at the signal, the silence is shattered by the army of Israel as they shout across the valley. I don't know what they shouted, but they screamed at the top of their lungs that they do in battles across that valley, and that noise filled the air. But from the other side, you would think you would hear the Philistines also shout and shake their spears, but there was nothing. Just quiet, nothing. It was strange. The Philistines had initiated this conflict, started this war, as they always seem to do. They were a very big power at the time, so what's up? What's going on? But something was up, wasn't it? Something was happening. To us, it would have sounded like a tank rumbling into place. There was no tanks back then, were there? To them, perhaps it was a massive catapult or some other huge armament that they used back in those days, rumbling along and shaking the ground. As they squinted and looked across the valley as the sun began to rise and through the mist and the fog, someone said, I think it's a big rock. It's a rock. No, someone said, I think it's a tree. And another said, I don't think so, it's moving. It's moving. And then an enormous taunting roar from the valley floor removes all doubt of what it was. It was a man. It was a man. No way. No way that could be a man, but it was a man, one man, taunting and calling out the army of Israel. And yet, they were fighters. They defeated many nations and many people. No one moved. No way. No one moved. It was just one man. 1 Samuel 17, verses 4. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistine named Goliath of Gath. Sounds Scottish, doesn't he? Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and had a weight, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And his staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam, that big beam that goes through a weaving press. And his spear's head weighted at 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. This was no ordinary man. Goliath, by all accounts, was about 9 feet, 6 inches tall. Now, I'm 6'2", or 6 foot. I reached 6'2" at one time. I think I'm going the other way now, as we all do. I'm starting to get shorter. I think I'm 6 foot now. So he's at least 3 foot taller than me. LeBron James is about 7 foot something. He's 2 foot taller than LeBron James. If you've ever been next to a pro basketball player like Shaq, even a normal guy looks shrimpy next to them. This guy was 9'6", 6 inches short of 10 feet, and the mass to go with it, and the muscles. Because if you read what he was wearing and carrying, this dude, as we say, this cat was strong. He was not to be trifled with. The human tank wearing a bronze skirt that weighed about 106 pounds. Any of you women like to wear a skirt that weighs 106 pounds? The head of his spear weighed 19 pounds. An Olympic shot put weighs 16 pounds. You know what 19 pounds is? I toss these around at home. This is 20 pounds. Caleb, you want to come and pick this up? Come and get this? You can show it around, let people pick it up if they want to. Be careful. Is it heavy, Caleb? Go ahead, let somebody else feel it. 19 pounds. Now, that's hard enough to lift, but imagine that's the tip of his spear, and he's got a spear the size of a weaver's beam, and this guy can throw that spear. Imagine trying to throw that with any kind of force. You can keep it there for a while. Give it to one of the ladies to lift up. Let's face it. As we say in the South, he's a big one. He's a big one. He's a giant with a message, a challenge. Verses 8 through 10. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all the Israelites heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. What he demanded was a challenge, mano a mano, one man, cage match, winner take it all. And Israel was terrified. But why? Why was Israel terrified? They had Saul. Remember, Saul was big, head and shoulders above everybody else. He was their king. He said, imagine that guy saying that. Well, we got Saul. Anybody see Saul? Where's Saul? Saul was hiding in his tent too. They didn't have Saul. When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were afraid. Israel was retreating, and Saul was right with them. Why? Because Saul had a problem, and his problem was perspective. Perspective. Saul, God's king-elect, you see, was on his own at this time. He was no longer the king that defeated so many of the armies, the enemies of Israel previously. He was on his own. That's how he wanted it. That's what he got. God left Saul. It's a sad truth, though, that when someone has tasted God's opportunities and refuses to see them for what they are and turns away, the shield that surrounds them, surrounds that person, is lifted, and the other side moves in. As we read, right, that Saul was tormented by an evil spirit since that time. You know, in James 4, 7, and 8, we're told, resist the devil, submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. This is what Saul failed to do. The bottom line is Saul is looking at a lie, and the problem before him is on ground level. From that perspective, giants are overwhelming. Goliath was too much. Too much. It's not like this was something new for Saul or the Israelites. They had giant troubles in the past, didn't they? Report of Goliath's imposing ancestors stopped a whole generation from going into the promised land, didn't it? When the generation of kids finally did cross the Jordan, it was only Caleb who told the truth about it. Only Caleb invaded giant country. See, giants didn't disturb him. When it came to Caleb's personal inheritance in the land of Canaan, we find him at 80 years of age asking Joshua, now, give me this mountain. He was a man of altitude, you see. Give me this mountain. He was a man of godly, heavenly perspective. You know who was in those mountains? Who owned those mountains? Who hung out in those mountains? They were filled with the Anakims. You know who the Anakims were? Caleb's 80 years old. He said, I want that mountain. They were descendants of Anak, an unusually tall people that inhabited Canaan before the Israelites' conquest. They were giants. The Anakim, like the Nephilim and the Rephaim, were known for their height. You can read that in Numbers 13, 33, Deuteronomy 2, 10 and 11. Caleb also was noted for driving out the Anakim from Hebron in Joshua 15, verse 13. But that's another story. Caleb saw things from God's perspective. not as Saul was now seeing things. Yet Caleb handled most of those giants he encountered, but at 80 years old, he didn't get them all, did he? Here was Goliath, and some of his kin were around too. We know that he had at least one brother, but most likely four. Specifically says he had one, but it seems like he had four other brothers too. When we are ground level, giants fill up the landscape, and the closer we get, the bigger they look. They aren't unusual. They should be expected. They're everywhere in our lives. They roam in every generation, in the valley of Elah, 1000 BC, and today in our valleys, in our lives. There are giants there. The Christian walk is filled with joy, peace, happiness, hope, and the love of God and mercy. But it's also populated with giants. They wait for us. They're taunting us. They're standing there mocking, trying to install fear in us and hinder us from taking another step down the road. The question is, what are we to do about it? If our perspective is at ground level, we'll refuse to face those giants, won't we? We'll turn and run from them. Our Goliath is waiting out there for us every day, and we're not getting past him. We're not going around him. Without God, our mighty mountain, our deliverer, our protector, facing, let alone defeating those giants that stand before us, is impossible. We can't do it. Saul couldn't do it. The Israelites couldn't do it. They were filled with fear. God left Saul, no longer with him. But God is with us. God is with you. God is with me. God is with all of us. In Romans 8:38, we read, Paul reminds the Romans, "For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation, Goliath, his kin, and all the Anakims and giants of the world, will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus the Lord." There is someone, though, that we have not yet focused on in the story. Remember David? We call this story the story of David and Goliath. Still tending the sheep. That's where he is. Although he's been able to spend some time at Saul's palace. In 1 Samuel 16 again, verses 17. And Saul said unto his servants, because he was being plagued by this evil spirit, "Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me." Then answered one of the servants and said, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, good guitarist, Jimi Hendrix of his day." John Mayer, for Aaron Preston if he's listening. "And mighty, valiant man, a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him." Verse 19, "Wherefore Saul sent messages to Jesse and said, Send me David your son, which is with the sheep." David was called a brave man, wasn't he? A warrior. But where do we find him? We find him out with the sheep, ignored by his father and family. He'd end up in the king's court, a singer, a guitar player, lute, harp. And he was also Saul's armor bearer. But then, kings back then had lots of armor bearers. This wasn't a big deal. It's like going to West Point or the Air Force Academy. If you wanted to be a commissioned officer, that's where you went. That's how you did it. You came up through the ranks. David did whatever armor bearers did. He took care of the king's equipment. He whipped up some tunes when he was feeling down and being plagued by this evil spirit. And he'd go back and take care of the flocks for a while too. That's where he was when Goliath started his taunts and threw out the challenge. And just as well, again, he wasn't of great importance. Verse 17 and 18. Let me see. "And Jesse said unto David, Take now," this is chapter 17, verse 17, "And Jesse said to David his son, Take now for your brethren an ephah of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp and to their brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look at how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. That's David. That's David, grocery boy, DoorDash driver, Grubhub driver, wasn't he? But as the story goes, David arrives just as Goliath's issuing this taunt and screaming out, as he's been doing morning and evening for 40 days. For 40 days. That's what he's been doing. The Israelites were preparing to fight a conventional war, and every time Goliath came out, they scattered and ran. The problem, the real giant in the valley was not Goliath. That's not who the real giant was. That's what they saw, but that's not who the real giant was. The real giant is the lack of faith and trust in God Almighty, their shield, their protector, their king, their God. It's easy to fall into that trap, isn't it? We try to deal with the problem from every which way, except the only way that it can be dealt with the help of God, with God by our side, with faith and trust in Him. When we look at life from the ground level, we ignore those giants. We run from them. We don't face them, do we? Rather than face them head on, relying on God to equip us and enable us to defeat them. In Psalms 125, verse 1, you don't have to turn there. It's one of the Psalms, the Songs of Degrees. It says, "They that trust the Lord shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abides forever." If you trust in God, you cannot be moved. You will be with Him forever. You will defeat all enemies. How do we deal with things? We have problems in our marriage, right? Instead of dealing with it, trusting God, getting on our knees, going to Him and correcting the problem as He reveals it to you with His help, we increase our activities, don't we? We avoid it. We stay late at work. I don't have to deal with her or him that way. I'll work harder. I'll watch sports, do TV. Oh, I know, I'll study the Bible more. Well, Bible study is great, but you need to deal with that giant and solve that problem with God's help. The thing is, God sends those Goliaths to our doorstep. He sends them. He does so to force us to look at life from His perspective, from His level. Those things that are happening in our lives that are so uncomfortable, God's allowing them to happen so that we turn and see things from His perspective, not from our ground level perspective. He wants us out of the dirt and the mud. He wants us to look up. When we ignore or try to evade those giants, well, godly living and growth just comes to a halt. Are Saul's officers and army any different? Every night they huddle in his tent, drawing up battle plans, perhaps praying, God, get rid of this giant. He's messing up our war plans, our strategy. Yet, after 40 days a night, what are they doing? They're still doing the moonwalk. Every time they go out there, they're heading the other way when Goliath shows up. Except today. This day, it's different. This day is different because what happened? David showed up with the groceries. David showed up. And Goliath came out, taunting, roaring, screaming his invectives, and David heard it. Verse 23 of 17. And as he talked with them, David talking to the men in the army, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man come up? Surely to defy Israel he has come up. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make him his father's house free in Israel. Wow. They heard all of that. What did they say? Did you hear that? The one who fights gets the king's daughter. Gets the king's daughter and doesn't have to pay taxes. The other one said, That's fantastic, but I'm already married. Sorry. I'm already married, and I love paying taxes. You know, it helps the country. And by the way, have you seen Goliath? That was their attitude. But that wasn't David's response, was it? David wasn't a person that was bothered by giant obstacles. Listen, he may have been interested in what Saul had to offer. Look how he was treated at home. He wasn't treated very good. Someone once said that he was probably 10 years old when he realized his name wasn't shut up, which biblically means hold your peace. But what really lit David's fuse was Goliath's words in verse 26. Those were fighting words. You see, David was different from Saul. He did not look at life from ground level. David, whose heart decides issues according to God's plan, sees life from God's perspective. Israel, Saul are ground level lookers. David looks at life from God's level, as God sees it, knowing that God is with him and is able and is there. Every problem is small in comparison, like flying over the country in an airplane and looking down at those people scurrying around in those cars down the roads, little tiny nothings. When we look at life from God's perspective, like David, we are ignited, we're stirred to action by the giants that block our path. We're not afraid of them. We see them as opportunities to overcome, to grow. What was an impossible problem for Saul was a great opportunity for David. For the followers of God, most often great opportunities come disguised as brilliantly disguised impossible problems. It's happened to me so many times in my life. Seems like an insurmountable problem or something that's never, and then if you look back over years and say, wow, what an opportunity that was. How great that was. Verse 26 through 37, I'm not going to read that. You can read it later. Verses 26 through 37. Saul, you see, was too cowardly to face Goliath himself, so he sent David, convinced he may have a chance by some of the things David said. Remember, he said, you're just a boy. You're not a trained soldier. This guy's a monster. He's a tank. He's a trained warrior. You see the head of his spear? You see how heavy that is and how he's made out? David said, I killed a lion. I killed a bear. And he said, I killed him because God was with me. And God killed that lion. And God killed that bear. And God's going to help me kill Goliath. He didn't say, I'm going to do it. I did it all myself. He gave the glory to God. Those giants attacking us day in and day out, those in our paths are actually attacking God. They're trying to block his plan for us, for you and me. Those plans, those obstacles, those trials in your life, those things that get you down, they are there coming at you trying to block and thwart God's plan for your life and what he's doing and his purpose for you. And we have to see that from his level, not from what we're going through, not from the mud. If we are living to do God's will and looking at life from his level, those giants in our valley are not in our right of way. They are in God's right of way. And if that's the case, they don't have a chance. It's most interesting to see how God works and helps us defeat the giants of life that stand in the way of his purpose for us. God works through us where we are, with what we know, to destroy the giants before us. He works with us where we are with what we know to destroy those giants. In David's case, it was just a slingshot. If you read the story through, remember Saul said, come here, okay, you're volunteering, here's my helmet, here's my armor, here's my sword, here's my spear. They say David was maybe about 15 years old or something, maybe 5'2". I can imagine what it looked like, a little kid in a dad's clothes. He said, I'm not trained in that. I haven't proved these. I don't know how to work with all of this. Get it off me. They took it all off. What did David take with him? A slingshot. Now, don't get me wrong. A slingshot is a powerful weapon too back then. But that's where David was, at slingshot level. Sometimes we're just at slingshot level. It's lethal, yes. It's the early version of a machine pistol with a 5-clip, you know. David, the time came. The time had come. David steps out of the perimeter where suddenly he's by himself against Goliath. Philistines on one side, Israelites on the other side, army shouting and yelling. David keeps advancing toward Goliath. One fall, winner takes it all. David keeps advancing. Giants are always God's open doors. But the closer he gets, the bigger Goliath looks. Goliath is bored. He's insulted. Wants the captain to return, signal and return. What's this kid doing out here? There's Goliath. What's Caleb coming out here to fight me? What's this kid? Looking for a souvenir? Excuse me. It's a terrifying story. No, he's coming. No, I don't believe it. He's challenging me. Goliath. I don't believe this. He's coming at me. He's challenging me. Am I a dog, he said, that you come at me with sticks? I'm a mighty warrior, 10'6", with all this arm. I got somebody carrying. You're sending a kid out here with a slingshot? How dare you? Verses 45 through 47. As Goliath, raging, moves closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him head on. David wasn't afraid. David wasn't heading south. David wasn't heading for the hills. There was a giant opportunity before him, an open door that God gave to David. He ran to him, reaching into his bag. He took out a stone, one of 5, remember? That was in the lack of faith. Remember, Goliath had 4 brothers. I would think that's David saying, after I take him out, anybody else wants to mess with me, I'm ready for the other 4. David ran quickly toward the battle line, reached in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, fired. Bada bing! Bam! Right in the forehead, right into his skull. Lights out. Down went Goliath, face down into the dirt. David ran up, didn't have a sword of his own, took Goliath's and cut his head off. Verse 50 to 51 shows us that when the Philistines saw their hero was dead, what did they do? They took off. Remember, the deal was one man, winner takes it all. If Goliath said, if I lose, we'll surrender to you and be your slaves. They ran for the hills. It was over that quickly. The Philistines fled. Israel won. Saul won. But that's not the end of the story, is it? It was the end of another day. There sat David exhausted, and I'm sure exhilarated by it all. Because when we conquer these giants that God sets before us, when we know they're defeated, when we know it's by God's hand, we are exhilarated. We might be exhausted from the ordeal, but we are exhilarated. What a day, David must have thought. He arrived that morning, a nameless errand boy, a grocery boy, delivering groceries, bread and cheese, water and milk perhaps. And now as the sun began to set, he is the champion of all of Israel, this young man. That's the way it always goes with those who see life from God's level. They become heroes, champions. It can happen that way for you. It can happen that way for me. I pray that it does. The giants out there gathering their armor against us, their spears and swords are in that valley of life. They await us. Every single day they're there. Peek out the door, Get up out of bed. There's giants waiting. Are you afraid of them? Are you worried? Are you worried? You have giants in your life right now that you're dealing with. Are you worried about them? Are you troubled? Are you searching for a plan of your own? You need to check your perspective. David, the boy with the sheep, was gone forever that day. David, the man, the warrior, the king-elect, David, the giant killer, took his place. God did that. God did that. In 1 Samuel 17, back in verse 47, we read, "The Lord saves not with the sword." See, when we look from his level, we don't need a sword. We don't need a Glock. We don't need an AK-47. We don't need an army before us. We don't need psychology and all of these things. When God is with us and we're looking from that perspective, everything is small and easy. It takes time and patience. But when we look from God's perspective, everything is small. It's the view that transforms ugly, deadly giants into opportunities and open doors. It's the view that will ultimately enable us to defeat all the giants before us, and more are coming, and more will come every day. If you defeat Goliath, he's got some brothers, and they're coming too. Until we hear those words, they'll keep coming at us constantly, till the very end, until we hear those words, each and every one of us. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Come. We've been waiting for you.